as a child, I went to the cinema, and it was really before movies were shown on television, and in fact, it was before television because I was born in 1943. So for images, for moving images, the cinema was everything. And children in Toronto would go every Saturday to the cinema. And I think I definitely remember Bambi, which was traumatizing, all these Disney movies, Dumbo, also traumatizing, because in each case it was some baby being separated from its mother. And of course for a child that's very traumatizing. And I also remember a movie that disturbed me greatly was Blue Lagoon, which was also about children being separated from their parents and ending up on a deserted island with a drunken sailor. And it was I had to sleep with the lights on after that movie. But also not these are the traumatic ones, but there are also many movies that were wonderful, of course, and a lot of Disney and a lot of cartoons as well in those days. You'd go see 2 movies with cartoons, with a news documentary as well. So every week basically. So that's the first. I have to say it was when I started to see European films that I began to think of, well, I've told this story many times, you'll forgive me if I tell it again, because there I was, and the cinema still exists in Toronto. At the time it was called the Pylon, and it has a different name now, but I think it's called the Royal. But in those days, I lived in a neighborhood that was full of immigrants, and many of them were Italian. It's now part of what we call Little Italy in Toronto. And I was watching my usual, which at that point would be a Hopalong Cassidy movie, and the Durango Kid. These were Western movies that you would see different ones every weekend. And I came out of the cinema with all the other children, and across the street was a cinema called The Studio, which only showed Italian films because there was enough Italian population to make that viable commercially. And I saw grown people coming out of the theater weeping, crying, and I was shocked because I thought, these are grown-up people, these are not children, and they're weeping. Some movie has destroyed them emotionally. So I remember crossing the street to see what this movie was, and it was La Strada of Federico Fellini. And that was my first inkling that a movie could have great power over anybody, not just children, but over grown-up people. And later it was European films, the ones we know, like Fellini and Antonioni and Bergman and Kurosawa and so on, who those films became my understanding of films as art, not just sort of something for kids.
And they were also maybe like your kind of film school.
They were my film school because there was no film school at the time in Toronto. And I'm completely self-taught. I never went to film school. When I started to get interested in film, and for me it was relatively late compared with what would happen if you grew up in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, of course, everybody had some family member who was in the film business. But in Canada, there was no film industry. There was television, there was a CBC, there was drama there. There was the National Film Board that made documentaries. But there was really no feature film movie industry. And so it didn't feel accessible. You never thought, oh, you can make a movie here in Canada. No, movies came from some other place, And the only film school at the time in Toronto was really Ryerson, which was really to teach cameramen, technical people how to work in television. So it wasn't really a cinema school in the way we think of it now. So I was completely self-taught, and seeing movies was the way I learned. I mean, I think that's the way everybody really learns how to make movies, is to see movies. Well, Toronto is, of course, it's my home. My roots are here. My parents were here, and my family history was here. But Toronto was really a very perfect place, really, for movie making, really, because it's halfway between Europe and Hollywood, and I think my filmmaking reflects that. It's a sort of, there's a commercial element, and then there's also a sort of European art movie element, and I think that comes from where I am, because many of my friends moved to Los Angeles. I mean, Ivan Reitman did, and Lorne Michaels went to LA and then to New York to do Saturday Night Live. And I think they're very influenced they've become Americans, basically. And I think their movie making reflects that as well. And I was reluctant to do that because I understood that the pressure, for example, of Hollywood is quite extreme. It's like a very dense planet. It has a great gravitational pull. And I think living in Hollywood, it would be very hard to not make Hollywood films, especially for someone who was not an American. And that was why I resisted it. Not that I hated Hollywood filmmaking at all. Of course, I loved it the way everybody loves it. But I felt there were other things that I wanted to do, not just that. And so that's, in a sort of conceptual way, why Toronto was important for me. And there was a moment when I almost felt I had to go to Hollywood. Because, for example, we have filmmakers like Ted Kotcheff, who went to London to make his films, and we had Norman Jewison, who went to Hollywood to make his films, and I thought maybe I'm going to have to do that. And I went to LA with a friend, and we rented a Mustang convertible. We drove through, and I met all kinds of people like Roger Corman and so on, and they said, because I had an idea for a film which later became Shivers, and I couldn't get it made in Canada. And they all said, well, we love this idea. This is a great idea. We would make this film, no problem. So I thought, I'm going to have to move to LA and become a Hollywood filmmaker. By the time I got back to Toronto, Cinepix, which was a Montreal company that was the only place in Canada that had at least started to make movies, and they were in French, in Québécois. They were French-Canadian movies. They said, we finally got what is now Telefilm, but then was called the Canadian Film Development Corporation, to invest in Shivers, and so we can make the movie. And that was the turning point, because I think another month I would have been gone. But so it was really the European model rather than the American model. That is to say that governments have to support the local, the national film industry, which is not what happens in America.
Mentioning Shivers, in your early films you deal with diseases, mutations of the body, issues that scare people.
Yeah.
People are afraid of that. Did you have to face your own anxieties about that, overcome them, or how did you go about that?
Yeah, it's funny because when I started to write Shivers, my first screenplay, I had no idea what I would write. I had been an enthusiast of science fiction, but not just science fiction, other wonderful writing as well. And at the time, I really did think I would be a novelist, not a filmmaker. I didn't. My father was a writer, a journalist, not a novelist. But I grew up with the sound of the typewriter, in the next room, and I used to fall asleep to the sound of my father's typewriter. So writing came very naturally to me. And when I decided to try my first screenplay, I had made a couple of underground films. It was really the New York underground film movement. It was the 60s, do your own thing, grab a camera. You don't have to go to film school. You don't have to be part of Hollywood. You don't have to join a union. You can just make your own film. And that was very liberating. And I had made a couple of films, and I had taught myself to do that by looking up in the encyclopedia. We didn't have Wikipedia then. Camera, lens, sound. How do you get the sound to synchronize with the picture? All of those things that people don't have to worry about now with video, or you can do that with your cell phone. But in film, it's a rather awkward, difficult process. And so I just had figured that out myself, and I had made 4, basically, underground films that had been shown in film festivals, at the Edinburgh Film Festival and so on. So I actually had a kind of international filmmaking experience before I did my first professional film. Shivers, I think of as my first professional, even commercial film. In other words, I was paid to do it. And I had other people looking over my shoulder, producers. I had to work with, when I first sat down with my first film crew, I had no idea what anybody did. I didn't know what an assistant director was. I didn't know what a production manager was. I had no idea because I had done all of that myself, shot the movie, edited it, synchronized the sound, done everything. So I had that experience before I started to write that screenplay. And I had no idea what it would be. I had done something called Stereo and something called Crimes of the Future. And they were slightly science fiction, but sort of also kind of dreamlike fantasy and so on. I wouldn't say fear was involved, in other words. I wouldn't say it was anxiety. It's more, I thought I would be a scientist as well, and I particularly an entomologist. I was very interested in insects and insect life and the strange forms of life that we have on this planet. I thought we don't have to go to some other planet to find alien life forms. We have them right here. They're incredible, and people just don't notice them, but they're fantastic. So I had that medical science interest. My science teachers all thought I would end up being a scientist, and at a certain point I went to the University of Toronto for a year studying organic chemistry, basically, and I thought maybe I would also be maybe a cell biologist, which now is the hot field. You know, cell biology is fantastic because, of course, it involves genetic structures and so on, and it's an expanding field. But so I had that background and that interest, and so it was very natural for me, in a way, to write a film that was like a science experiment. So it wasn't really so much about fear, even though it is a horror film, there's no question, and it's a scary film. But for me, it was an experiment, you know, and I was. It didn't scare me. The process of making movies was scary, though. That was terrifying, because it was very intense. I mean, my first film was 2 weeks shooting, a 14-day schedule. You know, that was very difficult, with a lot of special effects and guns and explosions and car crashes and everything else. The idea that you could have a movie on a shelf in your house that you could play any time was revolutionary. Nobody thinks twice about it now, but it was phenomenal, because when I grew up, movies were not on television. In fact, most people didn't have televisions. When there were televisions, television was very afraid of Hollywood, and Hollywood was very afraid of television. So they didn't go together. So you would watch television, and there were interesting television shows, and there was drama on television, but you couldn't see movies on television. And in fact, in those days, in Hollywood, you were not allowed to show a television set in a movie. The studios would say, okay, you can have a family, but I don't want to see in the corner a television set, because they thought of television as the end of cinema. The television would destroy cinema. And it was only when they began to realize that they could sell movies to television and finance movies by doing that, they realized that in fact the two went together very well, cinema and television. And in fact, at a certain point, people thought that the television had saved Hollywood. Meanwhile, Hollywood was developing widescreen, cinemascope, stereo sound, color, all of that to defeat television. Things that you couldn't get in television. The television, you had a very bad image, small screen, black and white. And so Hollywood felt that, in fact, television helped accelerate technical development in film. Of course, I was watching all of this. I was feeling all of this and sensing all of this, even though I didn't necessarily know the politics that were going on behind the scenes. And the development of video that you could control yourself was phenomenal. And I bought the first bunch of them. I had a Sony video recorder. There was even a tiny little video recorder that used normal audio cassettes to record video, and I had one of those. It was terrible quality, but amazing still. And this was in the 60s. I was experimenting even then, and ultimately with video cassettes and so on. That really made a huge difference because people had trouble with reel-to-reel cassettes, and you had to wind them up, and the tape would rip and so on. Anyway, I lived through all of that, and it was all very exciting, and but it really meant that you had control, that you had access to film in a way that you never had before. That you could have a library of films was an astonishing idea. Videodrome really came from the limitations of television at the time, which was, I remember as a child, we had an antenna that would rotate to pick up better. Each station needed the antenna to rotate to get the best image. So you would be watching your TV set, rotating the image and seeing it come into focus in a way. And sometimes when this is something else people don't now think of, it wasn't 24-hour-a-day television. It was, at 11 o'clock or 11:30, television was finished until the morning. You didn't go all night. And after all the television stations had shut down, you could sometimes pick up some strange signals from, now in Toronto it would be mostly from America, maybe Buffalo, maybe from New York, maybe from Detroit. And those signals were very weak, but you could pick them up late at night. And you would see things, but it would never be clear. And you wouldn't know what you were watching. And it was very mysterious and sometimes very disturbing and very intriguing. And so I used that experience with Videodrome. In other words, old technology really at the time. I even have scenes of a satellite dish, and so on. But of course, when I was doing it, it was an antenna, not a satellite dish. There were no satellites. It was just that idea of picking up a mysterious, forbidden signal that somehow you had access to by accident. And that's really what had to do with Videodrome.
And this idea of a hidden channel strikes me as something very valid and powerful even today. When you think of the internet, there is this dark net. So there always seems to be a place where people are hoping to find something forbidden.
Yes, that's actually true, and it's why people sometimes think that Videodrome was anticipating the internet. Of course, I wasn't really thinking about it, but it's true that some of the things that I was playing with, which is to say interactive television that would respond directly to you, is in a sense an anticipation of something that has become the internet, really. So it hasn't changed. And yes, there are some very forbidden imagery and videos on the internet, which, I mean, it's quite extraordinary that the police could come to your house and discover that you had downloaded some images and arrest you and put you in jail for a long time, mostly, child pornography and so on. But that's an extraordinary thought, that the images condemn you immediately, and that even though you just sat in your room and clicked to access them, but you were condemned by doing that. That's extraordinary.
Videodrome has also some groundbreaking, I guess, special effects, which are based on certain ideas, can be read as metaphors. How did you come up with these crazy ideas?
Well, I think in art it's always very mysterious as to where images or concepts come from. Sometimes it's very much an imagistic thing. Sometimes it's a conceptual thing first, and then becomes incarnated in some imagery. the idea of a hand turning into a gun, for example, is really begins conceptually. The idea that we are fusing with our own technology, or the idea that technology is not inhuman, which some people think that technology is this inhuman thing that imposes on us, but in fact it's not. It comes from us. It's part of us. It's an expression of us, and so that first concept. And then after that, you say, okay, well, how do I show that dramatically? And that's where I came up with the idea of, let's say, a video cassette that can go into your stomach, or a gun that will be your hand, will turn into a gun. Just to show the fusion of, or the relationship between technology and the human body. Technology really begins as the extension of the human body. The telephone is the ear and the voice. A gun is an extension of the fist, and so on. So you never know whether it's which comes first, the concept or the image. And of course, you can dream it. You can find it, by accident. And often it just comes while you're writing, while you're working. It just appears. I mean, even in Videodrome, you see a little Atari controllers and so on. I mean, I think it was obvious the idea of a tiny world that you enter and that you can play in and can have experiences in, a virtual world. It's really just an extension of the idea of cinema, but cinema that you can control and interact with, or television that you can control and interact with. Once you think in those terms, then a video game becomes an obvious thing. Even though I was thinking of it at a time when in fact there was just maybe Pong, there wasn't very much in the way of video games, but I was very intrigued by that. And I was very interested in technology for just as a matter of course. I could see that the typewriter was a ridiculous thing. And I could see that the editing that we did in film was ridiculous. The moviola, stupid. When I was shown these machines, now we have great nostalgia for them. And we have nostalgia for film because it connects to a history and an art and so on. But if you're working with those, you are not nostalgic. You can't wait for something better to happen. And I couldn't wait for word processing. So I remember the first PET, the PET. I thought maybe this will, no, it wasn't right. Because a typewriter doesn't work the way your mind works. It's a machine. It's from the Victorian era. It's clunky. When you want to go to the beginning and then to the end and then to the middle, you can't. You have to tape it. It's terrible. As soon as I saw what a computer could do, that it works like a mind, that it, in other words, not linear, but mosaically, everywhere, back and forth, up and down, left and right. You could change it, move it around. That's what I was waiting for. And I was waiting for that for editing as well. And so I couldn't wait for digital editing. I thought it's obvious it's going to come.
And when you imagined this world in existence, why did you choose to include no screens and to give it such an Earth-like feel?
Yes.
In terms of color and flat
Yeah.
images?
Well, because a screen is an artificial thing. Obviously, the ideal for a video game would be that it feels like reality, three-dimensional. So you remember that holographs and holograms were very, that was going to be a very popular big thing, and you don't read about that much anymore because I think the technology is very difficult. But that would be the ideal, would be that you had a game that you physically entered and that responded to you as a physical entity and felt totally real in a three-dimensional way. And so, and that's why I have the bioports that plug into you instead of plugging into a computer and a screen. A screen is just a stopgap, it's just it's only because we can't do it any other way, but it's not the ideal. We know what the ideal is, and that's why people are playing around with, glasses that will immerse you and all kinds of things. But we know what the ultimate is, and everybody's trying that with sort of motion control and all of that. Really, it's to recreate reality, but in our own image. That's what all art is that, in a way. All art is that. You try to do it through words with a novel. You try to do it with imagery and sound and technology if it's a film. But all of those they're not what we really want. What we really want is quite dangerous, but then that's the human way.
To me, Existence felt like, sci-fi and like a scary movie, but also it has funny moments. But these moments, I think, don't offer comic relief.
Yes.
But on the other hand, they are really scary.
Yes.
For instance, these game loops that Ted discovers. How did you come up with that?
Which part of it?
The game loops. This moments when, not so to say, reality is in question, but your own subjectivity.
Oh yes.
I think this was the real horror of that.
Yes.
Of that film.
Yes. Well, that's why I say that what we want out of art, out of games, out of our creativity is dangerous, because it would be a very potent alternate reality that would have the weight of full reality and the consequences of full reality, and would be very difficult to control, if not impossible to control in any way, and also would be incredibly confusing, because our minds, as the animals that we are, have not really kept up with our technology. I mean, you see this all the time. Every time you read the newspaper, we seem very animalistic and capable of the most incredible brutality and stupidity, and yet the most sophisticated kinds of technology and concepts and philosophy as well. And that would extend into this strange world of new realities that we would be creating, and they would also be on our own image, just as our technology has always been, which is to say, it would be the best of us and the worst of us, So that's and at the same time, I think I have not made any movies that aren't funny as well, But this is the human way of dealing with the absurdity of human existence. Is you have to have a sense of humor. Even if it's a scary one. One of the things that you inevitably deal with if you're working with actors is identity. When you say something you don't want to do, who's the you? Where is that you? In what does that you consist? I mean, of course, I deal with it in Spider in a more contemporary way, and because that's schizophrenia, which is in many ways an identity disease, a disease of identity, and it's very revealing. But of course, anybody who is working in the arts eventually must deal with the question of identity, even if it's only of the identity of the artist. What is the you that wants anything? And what is the you that controls the I? So all of those things are perfect subject for exploration.
Speaking of Spider, I guess theater of the absurd and maybe Beckett was an influence on that.
Well, I think Beckett for me is always an influence. But that was, of course, Patrick McGrath, the writer of the novel, who you have to give the credit as the originator of that character. But in the feel of the character cinematically, which is different, I think, enough from the novel, yes, I was thinking of some Beckett characters like Molloy and Murphy and Waiting for Godot, the characters in Waiting for Godot and so on. Almost tramps, almost vagrants. What are they really, though? And so there is some of that. At the same time, it's a fairly clinically accurate examination of schizophrenia, which and Patrick McGraw had worked in some institutions in which schizophrenics were confined, and so he had some interest. He had some real experience of schizophrenic people, and so in a strange way, it's accurate that way as well. I would say that Beckett's work is also, I mean, in a sense, I wouldn't say he was schizophrenic, but he had great insight into that kind of thinking of a person separated from his own identity and uncertain of what that identity was and where you find it when you lose it and what does it mean, you know.
I think in an interview you said, I am Spider.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
Well, I'm aware of just how close I am to a character who could lose his sense of self, identity, and it's something people don't think about until they have to think about it. But for example, when a schizophrenic says, "I hear voices, people are telling me to do things," and you say, "But there's nobody speaking." But you think of it, you know, you hear voices in your head all the time, you know, and especially now with the media that we have and people walking around with earphones. You're hearing voices that you remember. You're actually hearing voices of people who are not there because they're on your cell phone. And it'll only take a little bit of a disjoint to have those people be real and be right there for you, telling you things, controlling you. So I meant that I really felt that I wasn't looking, in this case, as Spider as a strange creature who I had no connection with, but actually as someone who I could definitely relate to.
David, could we pause a second, please?
I'll just open my mouth.
Spider is like a writer, like a.
Just give it 10 more seconds.
Yeah, just.
Yeah, but you go ahead and.
Yeah, like weaving his net, his.
Yes. I mean, we are all the creators of our own identities in a certain way, even if we feel that that's something given. But in fact, we are actively involved in creating our own selves. And I remember saying when I was, doing interviews for Spider and so on, you wake up in the morning, it takes you a while to become who you are. It's not just that you have to have that coffee, you have to remember who you are, where you've been, were your dreams real, who were you in your dreams. You have to reconstruct yourself every day. And if for some reason you could not do that, because of something that happened in your brain or your nervous system, I can understand that. I can feel that. I feel very close to that. So that's why I could say I am Spider and not be, being very arch or pretentious. I really meant that I felt very close to that character, as did everybody working on it. Patrick and Rafe Fiennes as well. I mean, the actor. It was a very difficult film to get made because it's not very commercial, and we all ended up not taking any money for it. And I include the actors, the producers, the writer, because we wanted Spider to exist, and it became a question of existence of this character. We couldn't allow him to disappear. We were so close. So we all agreed to take no money in order to get the movie made. All of us felt the same way. So it wasn't just me who felt close to Spider.
Also found very touching about the film is that he's trying to tell his story, to find his story.
Yes.
And he tells it to himself only,
Yes.
not to the audience.
That's right.
So the film is like detached, but therefore
Yes.
very touching.
Yes, yes. No, I mean, because I think most people in their daily lives, if you talked to them about being separated from themselves or separated from their own identities, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. But in certain moments of stress, of anguish, of pain, people realize that they can be separated from themselves. Sometimes they want to, because the pain that they're feeling is too great, and they must detach from that pain, and that therefore they must detach from some part of themselves. And that happens in moments of great stress, great loss, great disaster. You find this. I mean, people talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome and so on. This is all very much what Spider is experiencing.
How was it working with Ray Fiennes? How
Oh,
did
lovely.
you create this character together?
Yeah, well, we were very close. I mean, I still feel very close to him. Very easy, lovely man to work with, very intelligent, very sensitive. It's funny, he said to me, that's the least directing I've ever had. I've never been directed less. And I said, you know, when you're doing perfect work, I don't want to say anything. I don't have to say anything. It's partly because it's the script, but of course, when you're preparing for a movie with an actor, there's a lot of directing that goes on before you start shooting with the camera. You are saying what clothes, how is he shaving, can he shave, does he not shave, what is his hair like, what are his shoes like, how does he walk, how does he speak, and that's directing. And we worked on that a lot before we started to shoot. And by the time we started to shoot, he was Spider. I didn't have to, took almost nothing, you know. But that was the ease we had with each other, very easy and very, so it was really very delightful to work with him. I have a long, strange history with the Cannes Film Festival because when I was trying to figure out what I would do with my life, I spent a year living in France, and I lived in a small town called Tourette-sur-Loup, the Loup River. It was up in the Maritime Alps, a small medieval village, which I went to because a friend had discovered it, and there was a Canadian sculptor named Jim Ritchie who lived nearby in the town of Vence, and I just went to visit and ended up staying for a year. And that was very close to Cannes and to Nice. And at that time, I had made my underground films, and I wasn't sure really that I had a career as a filmmaker. I still wasn't sure what I would do. I was still thinking I was going to be a novelist. And I decided, because the Cannes Film Festival was happening, I would go down to Cannes and see what that was like. And I did, and I was horrified because, you know, I'd been living in this little town with maybe 900 people, no cars, and suddenly I'm in Cannes with the festival with Ferraris and motorcycles and helicopters and big boats and glitz and James Bond, you know, in front of the various hotels and so on. And I thought, this is not for me. You know, if this is film, I can't do this. And I ran back up to Tourette, you know. But then after a couple of days, I thought, I should go back down again. It's just as maybe I didn't, you know, my attitude was wrong. And then when I went back down, I loved it. Of course, I had nothing to do with the festival, which was far away and inaccessible, really. But I found that there was a whole world of filmmaking that I had not known existed. On the street corners, people were selling films like drugs, you know. They would be selling a Turkish film to somebody in Finland, or, you know, a Spanish film to someone in Argentina. And I got involved with these, just met all these filmmakers who were making films that you would never really get to see in Canada, let's say. They were so far from Hollywood. And it was a real community of colleagues of sort of international filmmaking, and I thought, this I could connect with this. It wasn't the Palais de Festival, but it was filmmaking, and I found that very congenial. And I think that at the same time too, I was able to stay in the Carlton Hotel in a very nice suite at night, because the Canadian Film Development Corporation, which as I say then became Telefilm, had offices there. And as a Canadian who had made some underground films, they said, well, you can, I said, I have no money, I have no place to stay. They said, you can stay here at night, and you have to leave in the morning because we have to open up the offices. So I was staying at the Carlton Hotel, with no money. That was it was very sweet. And so I had great affection for the festival, even though at that point I had no connection with the main part of it. But this was the marketplace. And later began to, show my films as part of the competition. And that was a wonderful platform for bringing, when you have a low-budget film and you don't have a lot of money to promote the film, you have people who come from all over the world who are interested in your film if it's in competition. So even if you don't really love competition for art, which I don't, it's a strange thing to compete for films and say, this is the best film, this is the best actor, because really the variety of filmmaking is so huge that you can't compare the films. You can have two films that are wonderful, completely different. But the competition is exciting, and it focuses on these 20 films, 22 films, and if your film can be one of those, and all film festivals work this way, but Cannes is the grand festival now, then it helps you sell your film and to get people to see your film. And so it's something that it's wonderful when it happens, that you can go to a festival like Cannes. Of course, I've been in Venice and Berlin as well, and they function in the same way, but each festival has a different character. It was an American story, and it came generated out of America. So even though it was shot totally in Canada, and in fact, I've never shot any film in America ever. Even though many of my stories, like The Dead Zone, for example, Cosmopolis, they're set in America, but they were shot in Canada. Yeah, I mean, there's a and of course beyond America, there's a kind of archetypal feel to that story. It's almost Ulysses, I mean, it's got its own Odyssey. It could be a Greek tragedy in a way, and in a way that's you. And this is well known, of course, in art. To be universal, you must be specific. You have to set your story, if it's a story. Of course, it doesn't have to be. It could be an image, but it has to be it will always be in a particular context. You can't make something that's universal directly. You have to do it through specific things, but that has resonance for people wherever they are in the world, and you hope that you hope for that. You don't always achieve that, In the same way, for example, that an actor cannot play an abstract concept. For when I was speaking, let's say, with Rob Pattinson about his character in Cosmopolis, I don't say, you are the embodiment of capitalism. And an actor says, how do I play that? What's my voice like? You can't say that. But you hope that through the playing of that specific guy, the New Yorker, the wunderkind New Yorker, hedge fund guy, that there will be a universal understanding of what capitalism might be, good and bad, and that you will understand it better through him, the specifics of him. So I think that's true in general of art. So once again, in History of Violence, very American story, very particular story set in a particular town and a state, but with kind of universal resonances. You hope for that.
There are two sex scenes that are, I think, central to the film.
Yeah.
They're very different.
Yes.
Why did you put them in, and what do you feel is the difference?
Yes. Yeah, they weren't actually in the original script, and they were things that I put in. Well, it's sex between a man and a woman who know each other very well, they think, and yet it's a sort of before and after. You know, it's a sort of during the illusion when they have created these characters together and this marriage together, and then afterwards it's a kind of all of that has been stripped away, and betrayal has been involved, and now it's just very raw between two people who almost don't know each other. It's worse than not knowing each other, because they have antagonized each other. It's sort of scenes from a marriage, really. You know, with Bergman film. That's a great film, a great TV series, actually. So my version of scenes from a marriage, you know, different moments in a marriage, which in that movie those scenes take place very, you know, within not too much time has passed between those two scenes. But if you are in a marriage that goes on for many years, you have many scenes from a marriage, and you have sex scenes that are, or love scenes or whatever, that are very different. You know, given the shifts and changes in people, it's very fascinating, very intriguing. There's no consistency, you know.
And the second scene happening after, like, Tom was forced to show this real,
Yes.
you might say so, I don't know, real identity.
Yes.
Is it the second time? Is it more truthful or more passionate then, or is it?
Well, it's more desperate. It's more desperate the second time, because there's a desperation to keep what they had, on the part of both of them, and yet it's much more raw, because, and in some ways it is more truthful, because now they are the real people to each other, and that's not always a good thing, and it's not always a bearable thing. I mean, there's a sense in which with different people we create a new character, you know. It's like acting. We do change depending on what our context is with each other, and there's no guarantee that because you are married to someone and you have sex with them a couple of times a week or whatever it is, that is the most real you. It's a construction, and a marriage is a kind of performance that goes on for a long time. It's a performance art piece, but you might have a friend that you are more real with than your wife or your husband, because of the chemistry. It's possible, I'm sure, you know. So it was an opportunity within a sort of a gangster film to have a really interesting observation about the nature of marriage. And when I first met Viggo, I wasn't sure we were going to get along very well. But then we started to talk politics, and we saw that we were on the same kind of page with speaking about mostly American politics at the time. And it's just developed into a really enduring friendship, which doesn't always happen. You know, it's notorious that a film set and people who work on a crew and the actors and the cast, it's very intense, very emotional, but it does disappear. And sometimes it comes back together again if you work with the same people, and sometimes it doesn't. But you find certain people who there's a lingering kind of relationship that doesn't die, that doesn't go away. And I found that with Viggo, really. We just connected in a way, and the way that we worked together, it was a real, very deep collaboration, with full of humor and full of research, and we found that in many ways we were very similar. And Viggo's a very unusual person. You know, he's an artist on many levels: photography, writing, poetry, publisher. He's not. He's very multi-dimensional, and that means there are many ways that someone like me can interact with him. And so it's been a friendship, and it's been lovely because I guess really I've never done 3 movies in a row with one actor, but I have with him, and that's been terrific. So we continue to be friends, and even if we never worked together again, although we're constantly looking for something to do together, he would still be a friend, you know, and that's rare. I deliberately wanted there to be no guns in Eastern Promises, partly because of the culture of the Russian gangsters. Not that they don't use guns, of course they do, but I was really thinking of the atavistic, the primitive, the ancient sort of Russian, pre-Soviet Union culture of Russia, and trying to give some sense of that without being too obvious about it, that it's very intimate and very emotional and very almost religious, ritualistic. And that means guns do not lend themselves to that. Guns lend themselves to disconnection. It's very easy to be disconnected from someone when you shoot them. It's much harder to be disconnected if you're stabbing them with a knife or strangling them or punching them. You know, then it's very physical and you're very much involved in that other person's body and mind and so on. And that's the way I felt that these criminals were. And so I decided to just have guns not be a part of the story.
You said almost religious. It
Yes.
almost feels like some kind of Christmas story in a way.
Yes.
Which is strange, knowing that you are an atheist.
Yeah. Well, I'm an atheist, but not all my characters are atheists. And so it's true that I don't think about God ever as part of my life or anything. But if you are a dramatist and you are working with characters who come from a particular culture, you have to accept their understanding of life and with passion, you know. So the Nikolai character, I'm pretty sure he believes in God, you know, and most of the other characters in the movie do too. Some of them are Muslims, some of them are Eastern Orthodox, and that's a part of their life, a part of their understanding of suffering, because everybody in life suffers, but not everybody thinks of that in religious terms. These people do, and they think of suffering as a way to salvation, also in religious terms. And so as a sort of their I am their God, really, you know. I'm creating them, but so that's religious in itself. So I am a very hardcore atheist, believe me, but you become like an actor, really, as a director or a writer. You must take on the character as that character is and believe in it as you're playing it, you know, and allow that character to exist as he would exist. So that's really what that's all about. So I have no problem with characters who are religious and believe in God. I would have a problem if that was the point of the whole story, because that bores me, you know, because I just don't have any intellectual or emotional respect for it, frankly. But as you know, in Eastern Promises, that is not the primary sort of dramatic engine.
There is a very impressive scene in the bathroom. I was wondering, what do you have to do to get such a moment? What is required in terms of, I don't know, trust or?
Well, it is a scene like the knife fight in the steam bath is a matter of trust, totally, and it's a matter of artistic integrity, and it's a matter of understanding. It's understanding what is required and accepting it and not being afraid of it. Of course, most of that had to do with Viggo. I mean, he had to. We sort of looked at it. I said, because in the script it just said there's a fight. You know, they didn't talk about where the towels were or what you saw or what you didn't see. So it was for us, the stunt coordinator, me, and Viggo, to work out. And also the production designer, Carol Spear, because I said, I want a theater, I want a theater for this ballet. So I need different interesting angles and parts of rooms and so on. She was creating that. And then with Viggo, ultimately he said, well, it will be ridiculous to try to have a towel around me all the time, so I obviously must do it naked. And I said, yeah. And that was all we talked about. That was it. I don't say that was easy for him, but he didn't make it difficult for me. Whatever he had to do in his mind to do that, because he hadn't done that before, not that. I don't think there are many actors who have done that before. He did it himself in his own head. Once he said this has to be this way, then there was no restrictions on me, what angle, what lens, what we see, what we don't see. But the way I work, I always have monitors, lots of them, and I always allow my actors to see whatever they want to see. Not just in this case, not just with Viggo, but any. And some actors really are very interested to see that last take and to see what they did, to say maybe refine it. And some directors are afraid of that because they're worried that the actor won't like himself or it'll take too much time or whatever. I don't feel that way. I feel it's open to everybody. Of course, in this case, it was restricted because he was naked. But for Viggo, he could see whatever he wanted to see. And he wasn't obsessed with it particularly, but it's a comfort to know that I'm not trying to hide anything. It's all there, And likewise in the editing, I showed him everything. There was no, So it is a matter of trust. It was our second movie together, and we knew each other well, our sensibility and so on. So it was. I don't think. It takes a lot of those things coming together, though, but mostly the relationships of the people for something like that to be done. I've never really had any sort of, there has never been a gender divide for me dramatically. My second commercial movie, Rabbit, has a woman as the main character, not the man. So, and when I was writing Existence, for example, it wasn't working until I changed the main character to a woman, and then it suddenly worked. So I've always felt, and even in Dead Ringers, which is, people accused me of being a misogynist, and I say, well, no, it's the characters are misogynists, but not me. That doesn't make me a misogynist. But even then, the Geneviève Bujold character is extremely strong. She is more than a survivor, she's the strongest person. The men are not. So that has never been, to me, an issue at all, we see wonderful movies like Lawrence of Arabia with no women, like none. Works fine, because that was the theater that was played then. It was no women. It was war, and that was it. So and I noticed that when I watched that movie. But it's of itself. It's not a political. It's not a statement of a social political statement or anything else. It's in the nature of what that story was, and that's the way I feel. It's just the way however the story unfolds. So I've never felt that I must have a male protagonist to feel connected to a film. That has never been the case. And that includes those two movies, Shivers, Rabbit, and existence that I wrote myself. Regarding Freud and A Dangerous Method, some people said that they were surprised that I would make a movie like that. And I had to remind them that the very first film I made, called Transfer, which was only 7 minutes long, was about a psychiatrist and a patient. It wasn't sci-fi, it wasn't horror, you know, it was a little surreal because they were having a psychiatric session in the middle of a snowy field, very Canadian. But so my interest in psychoanalysis and that relationship was, you know, it was deep because growing up in the century, Freud is a towering figure, and the idea of psychoanalysis, the structure of the ego and the id and the superego was, whether people were aware of it or not, was really the approach that people had to understanding human psychology and the dynamics of the unconscious and so on was all very Freudian. The idea of children, the child being father to the man, you know, that kind of thing. The influence of what happens to you as a child was not so common before Freud. In fact, people didn't think about children at all very much, you know, until they were adults. So his influence was huge, and I was aware of that, of course. And he was an iconic figure even when I was a kid in the 40s. And then if you're an artist and you're dealing with the psychology of your characters and the human condition, Freud is definitely someone you have to deal with. You either accept some of it or you reject it, but his explorations were definitely fascinating. And it always occurred to me that the relationship between a psychoanalyst and a patient was unique. It had never existed before Freud, and it was a unique, new kind of sort of basic, primordial human relationship, that you go to someone who you don't know very well, is not part of your family, is not your wife or your husband, and you're telling this person the most intimate, perhaps embarrassing things about yourself and your inner life and your dreams and so on. And this person is being relatively dispassionate and objective, is not reacting directly emotionally. It's a very strange relationship, and basically developed and created by Freud and his followers. So that in itself was intriguing. And so I think then when I realized that Christopher Hampton had done a play, you know, I was interested because Ralph Fiennes was playing Carl Jung in a play called The Talking Cure, and I noticed that, and that Christopher Hampton, who I knew very well as a playwright, and of course then as a writer of Dangerous Liaison, the movie, and then as a director himself. So this intrigued me, and I have never seen the play performed. But I read about it, and then I read the play, and I thought, I really want to do this. This is in a way going back to some basic things, to really see the development of psychoanalysis, how it developed, why it developed, how it related to the concept, the Victorian understanding of what they called hysteria, a disease that seems not to exist anymore. And that in itself was intriguing. How can there be diseases that disappear? Why do they disappear suddenly? Are they really social phenomena, does that mean, rather than sort of innate human psychic phenomena? And all of this was very intriguing to me. So I got in touch with Christopher, and that's how it began, the saga that ended up. It took a long time for various reasons to get the movie made. But for me, it was a totally passionate project, and very intimate, and very, to me, very. It was a movie I really wanted to make and had to make, and it always surprised me that people would say that's not a Cronenberg film, you know. Excuse me. I always wonder how people know what a Cronenberg film is, because I don't know what a Cronenberg film is, other than that it's a film that I want to make. To me, that's the only criterion that counts. And that was a film I really wanted to make. And its style, which is very formal, pleased me. And it came from, I don't think of my cinematic style as being innate. To me, it has to come from the material. I don't impose a style on. I have an aesthetic sense, and there are lenses I like to use and lenses I don't like to use, and so on. But I want the movie to tell me what it wants. The movie tells me what it needs. And in this case, because this was a very formal society where there were great propriety and people were very proper, and there were things that you said and things that you didn't say, and things that you could do and could not do. And of course, that's part of what made Freudian analysis what it is, because it was a very restrictive, repressed society. And he, in his own very formal, repressed way, broke that apart in the most revolutionary way. And so, to me, that it would then have been improper to use sort of, kind of shaky handheld camera and a documentary style or something very surreal. I thought that the material that they were all dealing with and the emotional intensity of it was what should be right up at front. So that determined the style of the movie. And it's interesting that when you find some people thinking they don't understand how that movie can come out of you say yes, it's more complex than you think. You can't really pinpoint an artist and say this is Cronenberg-esque and this is not, or however it is. And it's interesting when you go to an art exhibit and you see, as we had in Toronto, an exhibit of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. And people think they know what those artists are, and they certainly think they know, for example, what Rivera was, because he was a communist, and he was almost Soviet socialist realism in a Mexican style. But you see his early work, and it's Cubist. It's like Picasso, and it's beautiful, really good. And you see, you can't say this is not Rivera. He evolved, he developed, he had concepts, he changed what he was, but they're both him, absolutely both come from him.
And on the other hand, I think there are many moments or interests, obsessions in A Dangerous Method that are to be found in other films of yours as well. Mm-hmm. For instance, Jung, having this idea to help people reinvent themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something you dealt with in A History of Violence or in other...
Yes. Well, I think in terms of, at that point you're thinking of people's reactions. Most people who go to a theater, they're not thinking about the director and his style and his past. They're interested in the subject and the actors and so on, and that's correct. When there's a critic, then they have a desire to connect the dots. They want to see the arc of your career and so on. And they have their own idea of what you are and what you do, and maybe they've written about you many times. And so if you do something that's over here, it disturbs them. It has much more to do with them than with you, the artist. It has to do with their mindset and their desire to put things in their proper place, so they get upset or they, But I agree with you, though, that I think the connections amongst all my movies are, probably pretty obvious. I don't think it's too difficult to find those connections. And it depends on how astute you are, how accurate, how clever you are as a critic, whether you see those things, and whether you want to emphasize those things or you're more interested in what's different instead of what's the same. But at that point, it's not a creative question for me, it's really a critical question for them.
Again, there is, I think, a very interesting love or sex scene with Sabina Spielrein and Carl Jung when she is studying herself in the mirror.
Yes.
I found that very interesting, very strange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of course, no one quite knows what kind of sex Carl Jung and Sabine Spielrein had, and of course there's some people who still deny that they ever had sex at all, although from her writing it's very obvious that they did. And those writings were discovered quite late, so maybe it's understandable that before that maybe it was not certain. But what kind of sex would it be? And it's a little bit sadomasochistic, and in my understanding of it, because she was a bit of a masochist, and I think in her treatment, I think Jung cleverly used that to help her understand her own sexuality, her own sensuality, her own worth, and so it came to me to be obvious that that would also have an influence on their own sexual adventures together. And that's why I played it that way. And of course, she was not just a patient. At that point, very soon, she became a budding psychoanalyst herself, who was, as Jung did and as Freud did, her own subject. She looked to herself first, because especially in those days, when it was hard to find people who would submit to psychoanalysis because it was considered very embarrassing and very strange to do this, you analyzed your own dreams, you analyzed your own sexuality, you analyzed your own sexual experiences as a young person or even as a child, you analyzed the potential sexual energy between you and your parents, because that was your basic subject matter. And so I felt that in that sex scene, Sabine would be watching herself. She's experiencing the sex and the sort of Sado S&M aspects of it, but she is observing herself as well. She wants to see herself as a subject, not just experience it directly. And also, and then of course that scene upset a lot of Jungians who want to see Carl Jung as this kind of angelic, heroic figure, but of course he was as human as anybody else, and it admits it in his own writings. But I did actually play him as not being sadistic. He seems in those scenes to be rather uncomfortable, and we did that deliberately. In other words, he's doing it for her. He sees that this kind of cathartic thing that was always part of her being spanked by her father, but became a kind of neurotic impediment to her life. He plays the role of her father and allows her to be fully sexual, and that releases her. But it's not something that he enjoys. So I wasn't really playing him as someone who was sadistic. And a lot of, I think, critics, and especially Jungians who were upset by that, did not see that. They didn't understand that.
Yeah, there's a real sense of, I don't know, community. They are helping each other to
Yes.
fulfill their
Yes.
desires.
Yes, and the fact that they were lovers, and that their sexuality and their emotion completely permeated their concepts and their passionate philosophy, and the creation of this new thing, this psychoanalysis, is perfect. I mean, it's what's exciting about the movie. There was no separation of emotion here, intellect here. They don't come together. No, they were together. And I think, in fact, in truth, it is that way in all people. But we have a feeling of being sort of intellectually distanced from ourselves emotionally, but it never happens. People who are able to convince other people that some concept, some idea they have, whether it's Darwin and evolution, or Einstein and the theory of relativity, even in the most cold kind of mathematics, there is great emotion because it comes from humans. It's always connected with emotion. The two go together. And that is one of the things that intrigued me about these people, that the two always, the art, opera, when she sees Wagner, she sees herself impregnated with a Siegfried baby, and that is Jung, who she's creating psychoanalysis with, who will do that. I mean, it all comes together. It's fantastic. Well, you see in the movie, he himself is trying to figure out what humans are, and has become so abstracted and cerebral, and so caught up in the capitalist zeitgeist that he has lost sight of what he is. Once again, of course, an identity question. He could be Spider, really. You could see Spider in the back of the limo. And you do see, as the movie progresses, he begins to find himself. He becomes more human, more vulnerable. But there are moments, and this is all, of course, from the book by Don DeLillo. This is what people say, he says, isn't it? This is how they react. This is how a man talks to his wife, isn't it? He's not sure. He's inventing it. He doesn't really know. He is so good at what he does, this sort of money trading that is so abstract. And really, it's even abstract from money. You never see him touch money. He doesn't actually know how to deal with money. He doesn't know how to take money out of his pocket and pay for something, which is you see in the end scene with Paul Giamatti talking about the credit card and so on. These are the physical things that you must do as a normal person. But Eric doesn't do that. He has people who do that for him. It's all abstract, it's all computerized, it's all what they call high-intensity trading, which is trading stocks not because you love the product, not because you're trading Apple and you love your Apple computer. No, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with computer money digitizing. And so it's separated from what Marx used to talk about, which is the means of production and goods and actual physical things. It's completely abstracted. And so he himself is abstracted from being human. And in the movie, he is, in a sense, the whole movie is leading to self-destruction. But it's to destroy something that he wants to escape from. He's trying to escape from what he is. And of course he does succeed.
There's the moment he's talking about rats to his colleague, and then the outside world, there is this happening, and they are dealing with the rats.
Yes.
So I got the impression maybe this whole thing, which he first mentioned, and then the outside world reacting outside the limo could be just like an apocalyptic dream of his.
Yes.
And the end, being shot, would, as you say,
Yes.
mean waking up.
Yes.
Like
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there is, without pushing it too far, but he has created a kind of surreal reality to him for his life, that he conducts it primarily in his limo, that he makes everybody come into this strange world he's created. He doesn't go out into the world. And so the separation of fantasy and reality and intellect and reality has kind of dissolved. And of course, the limo windows are screens. Literally for me, as a director, because we're using green screen everywhere, and then at the same time, there's screens for Eric in the car. They're almost touch screens, the windows, and what he sees, like the rat lady with the rat at the window, could be a computer game, and the window of the limo could be an iPad, and so you very much get that sense. And I think people who see the movie, who live now in that kind of technology, will understand that completely. That everything is touching. But it's all screens. It's what we were talking about before. Screens are still not our ideal. It's still an artificial barrier between us and this sort of virtual, immersive, real 3D reality that we would perhaps like to be able to create. And so there is a very dreamlike element to the movie. Without, as I say, I didn't want to do sort of dream sequences or flashbacks or anything like that. But just the limo itself, for example, there's a discussion in the movie about how quiet it is. And I make it completely silent when the doors are closed and the windows are up. much more silent than it could ever actually be. And my sound guys, you know, when we were doing the sound mix, they were very worried about that. Don't you want some sound of the tires or some sound of the road? And I said, no, I mean, this is in a way, it's not realistic, but it's the way Eric wanted it to be. It's sort of his imagining that the limo can be completely soundproofed. He even admits later that that's impossible, that the sounds of the city will come in. But he's made the attempt. And so that in itself, without being too obvious, and especially to a normal audience, which is not necessarily that aware of what you're doing with sound, although they feel it, it would give this kind of surreal, dreamlike feeling to whatever happens to Eric in the limo. And then really that tone pervades the movie, though it's fairly realistic in what we shoot.
It creates a constant tension. Yeah. It's also, it seems to be this space like a mixture of a coffin and a uterus, if you will. So it's a very strange, disturbing place.
Well, the limo became many things. I mean, yes, a uterus and a coffin, a tomb, a vault, but also a spaceship, a video game. I mean, there are many things that the limo becomes during the course of the movie. A sex toy, you know, all kinds of things.
There were people who said, it's maybe a film about the crisis, but not really about the crisis, and we know all this stuff, and but I felt that it is a film about a crisis, but not necessarily about the financial crisis, but about the crisis of, as you mentioned, connecting and meaning. And this is an overarching...
I think it's interesting. I mean, in a way, the financial crisis maybe hurt people's understanding of the movie because it diverted them into thinking only about that. But in fact, in the movie, there isn't really a financial crisis. Eric creates his own disaster economically. And yes, there are protesters protesting against capitalism in the streets. But there's really no suggestion that there's been a disaster on Wall Street. It's his own disaster. He's done it on purpose. And you realize gradually that he's been stubborn about his investments, and all his people are warning him that he's in trouble, and he still goes ahead. He deliberately destroys himself. So it's really Eric Packer's financial crisis, not anybody else's in the movie. And of course it's hard because of the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations and some other strange things. For example, Eric gets a pie in the face by a sort of anti-financial activist. And Paul Giamatti texted me and he said, I can't believe this, but Rupert Murdoch just got a pie in the face. And it happened while we were shooting. So it was very tempting to connect what we were shooting with what was actually happening in the real world. But in fact, that's not what the movie's about. And in a way it can be a distraction, and perhaps the movie will be seen more correctly later, you know, when there is, we hope, maybe no financial crisis. We'll see.
But what indeed is very scary, I think, is maybe not the coincidence with Occupy Wall Street, but Eric's comment that yesterday it was a global protest culture, and today it's forgotten.
He even said 2 hours ago, a global protest, and now forgotten. Well, that's been happening, and there is a sense that there is a momentum in the world, and of course you see there are documentaries and discussions right now about all the things that happen on Wall Street and with these investors, none of whom has ever gone to jail, ever been taken to court. They're still out there functioning, and Wall Street is working as it always did. So it takes a lot to really derail capitalism in the modern world. Would take a lot more than just an Occupy Wall Street. And after all, it has been pointed out, and I think accurately, although you can discuss it, that the Occupy Wall Street movement wasn't really anti-capitalist. It was really, we want to share in the profits of capitalism. We want more people to have the benefit of capitalism. But it wasn't saying capitalism per se is bad in the way that Marx said that capitalism was bad. They weren't looking to replace capitalism with something else. You know, people like to say age is just a number and so on. And it is strange to think that I'm 70. I mean, I really honestly cannot connect me and my life with that number and what I would think of 70 as being and so on. Very strange, very strange. But of course that life is full of that strangeness, you know, that you become things that you weren't before and that you anticipate and that people have understandings of and that you did, and then you realize that it's quite different, really. You know, 70 is, it's meaningless in a way. So though I'm sort of, you know, honored to have somebody notice that my 70th birthday is coming up, and in some ways it means absolutely nothing, you know. So I just continue. I don't really have a particular, you know, birthday wish, but thank you for asking. You know, I sometimes say I don't really care about cinema. I'm not really passionate about cinema. And then I think, well, in some ways that's actually true. Because there are people I know, friends like Marty Scorsese, who are very passionate about cinema, are concerned with preserving cinema and restoration of old films, which is fantastic that he does that, and the history of cinema and so on. And I think I'm not like that. Why is that? And I think it's because it's the creative act of the imagination that is really what I'm passionate about. It's not the form, it's not the technology. And that's why I have no trouble saying video is fine and great. I have no nostalgia for film, like film stock, except for the smell. I like the smell of film. But I thought we could have an air freshener that smelled like Kodak film, you know? And that would be fine. I wouldn't need the actual film itself. So I don't have that, other than historically, I don't have that incredible, intense, aching nostalgia for the technology of film, for example. In a way that frees me. And as I say, if cinema disappeared, you know, I'm writing a novel anyway, you know, and for some people the novel has already disappeared. You know, that's a theoretical thing. So it's really just human creativity that is a passion for me, but not the actual particular form of it. I can, as long as, I mean, it would be very difficult if I could not express myself in a creative way. That would be difficult. But there's so many ways you can do that.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.